Well, good morning, and welcome to Great Decisions 2019. And how's the microphone today? Is everybody here okay? Good. Because I think you'll agree that today's topic is most important one, as have been all of our topics in this series. This is the 7th in our series of 8 discussion sessions on the top foreign policy and international affairs issue of our day, with topics chosen by the Foreign Policy Association in New York, and these events are conducted nationwide each year. So, and we're probably one of the first councils to even start in January to do our series during the winter time here. What else are you going to do on Saturday mornings? On a rainy Saturday, anyway. But as the World Affairs Council, as you know, is a nonprofit, nonpartisan educational organization. We've been around for 50 years here in Hampton Roads. I really want to thank our sponsors, specifically the Norfolk Arts and Humanities Commission, the Slover Library Foundation, that really helps us, as well as our host here, Norfolk Academy, and we really appreciate their sponsorship. The others are in your program, but I do want to welcome Norfolk Tug, our newest sponsor that just came on board this week. So hopefully this catches on and we get more support from the community. We can do bigger and better things. With that, what I'm going to do is turn it over to Dr. Matthew Hall from Old Dominion University to introduce our program today. Matt.
Good morning again. Thank you all for coming out. We've got another good turnout for a great speaker on a great subject. I am once again particularly excited to be introducing our speaker, in part because she's a fellow Old Dominion University GPIS graduate. She has her master's in science from Virginia Tech in applied statistics, her Ph.D. from Old Dominion University. She's an assistant professor with the Old Dominion University Modeling and Simulation Center. She has done extensive field work in her subject area. Her dissertation field work was done in Rwanda. More recently, she has conducted research in Greece, Colombia, and Peru. Her specialties or her research interests, inside modeling and simulation, agent-based research on refugees, forced migration, and gender. And if she seems particularly happy, it may be because, correct me if I'm wrong, very recently she was awarded from, as the co-PI for a $1.5 million grant from the Department of Defense on a project that will research, the capacity for communities to absorb crisis. Crisis, yes, thank you. Crises, I suppose, yeah. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Erika Freydenlund.
Thank you for having me. If I don't talk loud enough, let me know. I'll try to talk loud. Okay, so this is Rwanda, and I'll get to that towards the end. I'm going to take you on a little journey of my fieldwork first. But I didn't really know what to talk about when I came here, because I could give more than a semester lecture on forced migration research. And so where do you really start when you have 40 minutes to talk about the thing I'm most passionate about? And so I thought and I thought and I thought, and I started with my name. So when I was studying for my doctorate, my dissertation advisor told me that there's a little piece of everyone in their dissertation. So there's something about you. It's not just a randomly chosen topic, generally. There's something about you that made you interested in something that you're basically going to have to study by yourself for the next 5 years, right? So I thought about my name and the fact that I grew up in the United States. I'm from Virginia Beach, and every time my name has been on the roster, the teacher thought I was a foreign exchange student. And that every time I was in a school assembly and they call out your name, you know it's you, because they're like, ah, and there's this long pause before they call out my name. That was me, so I knew. And so this is why. My middle name is Japanese, my last name is Norwegian, and actually Erika works both ways. So Erika is a Japanese name, Erika is a Norwegian name. And so I don't know if this is because I'm a girl. Often women are the purveyors of culture and family stories across generations, but I grew up knowing all of the immigration stories of my family. So I know about my family that came over from Norway. This is a picture of my mom and my grandmother. I think my mom looks just like me. But so my mom grew up in post-World War II Japan, and my grandmother didn't have a choice but to marry an American soldier. It's a long story. Anyway, so my mom was about 10 years old, and my grandmother met this man who became my grandfather. He's a Mexican-American, and his story that he rejects completely is that, this is a family rumor, that he was born in the back of an 18-wheeler that was illegally crossing the border from Mexico to the United States, and he was born in the trailer, right? But he swears that he was born in a very tiny town that just happens to be on the border of Texas on the US side. And so he grew up speaking Spanish and English. He has a crazy story, but he ended up in the Navy and served 30 years. He lived in Japan for most of his life and spoke Japanese and English and Spanish fluently. If my grandfather knew today, because he's passed away a long time ago, but if he knew today that there are people whose citizenships are being revoked, essentially because their passports are not being renewed, for those people who were born in those tiny towns in Texas to midwives on the border, he would roll over in his grave. This is somebody who was American through and through, right? He wore American shirts, and his golf bag was an American flag, and he drank Budweiser. He did all of the American things. And so I think this pathway of migration has really been embedded in my life. So one last story. My grandfather, after he married my grandmother, got stationed in the US, and this was during Vietnam, and the military lost his paperwork. So he couldn't leave, but he couldn't get paid. So my mom and my grandmother found themselves in the United States, and this is not their native language, but they had to go work in a factory to pay the bills because my grandfather didn't get paid for years by the military and couldn't leave. And so this is the Glass Bottle Blowers Association. This was my mom's ID card for her workplace, but actually she worked, it's because they made baby food jars. She actually worked in the men's underwear section, which was essentially a sweatshop. And her story was my grandfather's sister got them this job. They worked 12 hours a day sewing men's underwear. And my grandfather's sister said, okay, when immigration raids the building, just sit there and sew like you belong here, because they'll only chase the people who run, right? And so this was my mom's introduction to life in the United States. She was, I think, about 17 years old. She had to drop out of high school in order to keep her little sister in school. And so this immigration story is part of my life. My mom grew up to do the quintessential immigrant thing, right? She started her own business, she employed 5 other people, and she retired as a seamstress, ironically, I guess, from all that sewing. And so I think this story is embedded in a lot of Americans, right? That on some level we understand that the migration journey was very difficult, and at some point there's generally this story at the end of triumph, right? My grandfather came from these really humble and precarious beginnings, but retired from the military as an E9 or something, and my mom started her own business in the United States. So these immigrant stories are ones that we cling to as strength and community, and we can really get behind it. But one of the things that comes with that, the generations that become removed from our immigrant stories, is how much privilege is really embedded in our current situation, right? So this is my most prized possession, and it's my US passport. And I think about it all the time when I'm doing field work, because my US passport gives me so much mobility privilege that I really take for granted. Right? I don't need a visa to go to the vast majority of places, and when I get there, they're like, sure, stay for 90 days, do whatever you want, right? That's amazing. That's amazing privilege that most of us don't think about. When you're planning your next jaunt to Europe for a week, you don't even have to think about whether or not you're going to be rejected at the border. It's so rare. I get a little offended when they search me extra, right? When my mom traveled with me to Europe last time, they were clearly targeting Asian people because all of the Asian people kept getting extra security. She got screened twice. She's 70. She's probably not a threat. And she has a US passport. She's a US citizen now. But my mom constantly worries that there's a chance that someone could revoke her citizenship, right? She didn't get it till she was in her 40s, and so she thinks, maybe they could take it away one day. And my research partner is Colombian. He has to get a visa everywhere we go, and he always gets picked out because he's got really dark skin and they think he looks really sketchy, I guess. So when you really think about this immigrant story and how much many of us reflect on this background of strength and resilience and sort of bootstraps, we don't really think about how much that bought us in the end. It's not just that it bought us the American dream. The American dream is so much bigger than that. It means the ability to travel wherever you want, whenever you want, on almost no notice, right? Somebody could call and say, hey, can you go to Canada to give a lecture next week? Not a problem, right? I don't need a letter from the university. Actually, Canada's the place I've had the hardest time getting into. But I got a little offended when I went to Turkey in January, and my research partner, he was like, haha, you have to have a visa, and I don't, because Colombians don't need a visa to go to Turkey. So just think about how much mobility, privilege that comes with your citizenship, not just the opportunity to be American and freedom of speech, but the ability to leave if things are not the way that you want them to be. So we hear a lot about displacement in the article that you read, which was a really big overview. Talked a lot about metrics and the global migration. And one of the things that I think about, because I do have a statistics background, is that we know that the displacement of people in the world is going up. The UN Refugee Agency's job is to sensationalize this number because they need it to gain, policy access and donations. And so they say, there's more refugees now than there ever have been in the world. But there are more people than there ever have been in the world, too. And so, you think about, well, what does that really mean? So this graph I constructed out of the UN's data on different types of displaced populations, so refugees, asylum seekers, internally displaced people who have not left their territory, and people who are stateless. And this is as a percentage of the world population. So as the world population increases, we're looking from 1990 until 2016. And some of these numbers they didn't actually start recording as separate numbers until much later, you can see. But what you notice here is that the refugees is the gray line. So yeah, there are a lot of refugees and the numbers are upticking, but actually overall, we're looking at a slight decline in the number of refugees. But the red line is what's really concerning, right? So the red line is the number of internally displaced people in the world. The vast majority of people that we really should be worried about don't make the news. And you think, well, okay, so you're internally displaced. Don't think about it in US context where like you could go to California and get a job somewhere else. In many countries, there are so many languages. You could be displaced and end up in a place where you don't actually speak the primary language. You may not have brought with you any paperwork that lets you work without being exploited. There's nothing that you may have brought with you in that moment of fleeing that guarantees you any kind of rights or privileges in the new place. So yeah.
What's the definition of
An internally displaced person is somebody who's been displaced for either conflict or environment, but has not left the territorial bounds of their country. So a Congolese person who is still within Congo, but within the two different provinces away, they're often living in camps or informal settlements because they don't live there. They lost all of their property when they fled. So they suffer from the same vulnerabilities as refugees, only without having left their country. And I'll talk about why this is a really important number to start thinking about, and also why, even though the number of refugees isn't increasing, it's actually still a really big problem. Okay, so I want to start in Cucuta, Colombia. Most of you have probably heard about Venezuela in the news. The fact that the Venezuelans are fleeing en masse, and they have been for a long time. They think that this will be bigger than Syria. The Venezuelan refugees are economic refugees for the most part. Some of them are political. And they are Cucuta, Colombia is on the border of Colombia and Venezuela. And it has a long history of border relations. People cross borders all the time to get goods, to do work, to do all kinds of things. So borders are relatively porous. But right now, there's about 150,000 people per month crossing the border from Venezuela into Colombia. And to put that in perspective, when we were all supposed to be freaking out about the migrant caravan that's coming over the border, that's one every single day, right? So we are worried about one in a quarter, one in a year. 3,000 people is a blip on the radar. There's sometimes 7,000 people crossing just one of the bridges in Cucuta every day. And for the most part, the border guards that check people's IDs are very, very lenient. The volume has become so extreme that the Colombian Border Patrol's main priority is not to check anyone's documentation, but only to see that people are not trafficking children. This is the only thing they can do. This is a triage situation, right? So basically someone comes and they're like, oh, I forgot my ID, but I really need to go over and get some food. They're like, cool, whatever, come back within 3 days. I don't know how they know because so many people are crossing, but that's what they tell them. Just come back in 3 days. It's on your honor. But every child that crosses that border, they pull aside and they say, okay, what is your name? What is your parents' name? And another Border Patrol agent's asking the person accompanying them. And if those answers don't match up, then they will take them in. That's all they can do right now. And so when you think about 150,000 people per month crossing into a very tiny town, you wonder, well, how are they dealing with this? Can they still go to the hospital? Are the lines really long? Because people are literally coming over the bridge in labor to give birth because they know that if they give birth on the Venezuelan side, there's a good chance they're going to bleed out, right? Like, there's no kind of order right now in Venezuela that would guarantee your safety, and so they literally come over just to deliver a baby and then walk back across. And so how does this affect people who have to live, people from Cucuta who have to live in this community? When we asked them these questions, their answers very surprising and very in contrast to what you hear on the news on the American side. Their answer was, meh. I mean, it's a lot of people. But, you know, if you have nothing, what's a little more nothing? They're already poor and they're used to migration, and they remember that for the last however many years, decades, that Colombia has been in crisis, the Venezuelans have taken them in. Right? And so what you see at the border, the vast majority of these people are without resources because the Venezuelans who have money fled to other places and they took their capital and started businesses in Miami, they started businesses in Spain. The ones who are fleeing the border right now are the ones who don't have the means. And many of them go back and forth and have a very complex border identity. But if they can, what they do is they raise the money to try and pass through Ecuador and get to Lima, Peru. The reason is because Lima, Peru is trying to assist with the migration crisis. So as a background, actually Latin America is much better about refugees than we are. They have a much broader definition of who a refugee is than the UN makes us all abide by. So they also include economic migrants as a reason to flee. And Peru started a visa program. So if you can get to Peru, they don't get you there, but if you can get to Peru through Ecuador and take this many hour bus ride, they will give you a 2-year work permit, no questions asked. So if you're Venezuelan, you get to Peru, you can get a job, whether that's as a doctor, a lawyer, professor, or a guy who sells gum on the bus. You can have a visa for 2 years. Right now, the Peruvians are working with a bunch of migration officials to try and figure out what to do because those 2 years are coming due very soon for many people. How do we extend that? And ultimately, most Venezuelans are not attempting to stay in Peru. They send a few, those people make money and they try to send it back to Venezuela. Or they're trying to move on to Argentina where they can get even longer work permits. And so ultimately, even though people in Venezuela are suffering immensely, what they're trying to do is send remittances back home. And the reason is because home is always home, right? We have this idea that migrants are rushing our border because they all desire what we have, right? The American dream. But most people love their home somewhere in their heart, right? So the most comfortable place to be is where you grew up with the food that you love, right? With the language that you speak, with the people you consider your your neighbors and your family. It's a very, very hard journey to make as an immigrant. And that's why when the demographics change and you see all of these young single men coming, it's not because it's some force that's trying to inundate the new country. It's because they're sending their most able-bodied people to work and send remittances so no one else will have to leave. Because no one wants to leave their country. And a lot of refugees you talk to, they dream of going to college in the United States so they can go home one day and help rebuild their country. And that's something I think we could get behind, right? In terms of foreign policy, that's a great thing. I want to educate the next generation so that they can help rebuild their country as well. So I want to take you to the next sort of wave in migration. Cucuta, Venezuela, Colombia, Peru, all of the South American stuff is happening right now. This is very recent, and it is in its flow stage. Lesbos, Greece is something you probably also know from the news. This is, if you don't remember, the image of Alan Kurdi, the little boy washed up on the beach. This is that story. So Lesbos, Greece is about 5 kilometers from the Turkish border, right? It's 5 kilometers. It means it's so close you can almost swim it, right? There's just so much temptation. And one of the things that the Greek, the Frontex, which is their Coast Guard, says is that actually, so 5 kilometers is just enough to see the curvature of the earth. And so when you're standing on the beach in Turkey and you look out onto the Greek shores, Europe is right there, it actually looks a lot closer than it is because what you're seeing is the horizon and Greece is just past that. So the temptation to make that journey, thinking, well, I don't know how to swim, I've never been anywhere near the sea before, it's so close that you think, well, how bad could it be? What's behind me is so bad that this is just a short little journey and I can make it. Even though the death toll in the Mediterranean is about 17%, a teenage girl went missing recently. So this is Lesbos, where in 2015, you started seeing in the news that thousands of people were arriving on these really, these like rubber dinghies that were totally unfit for sea fare. And this is their life jacket graveyard. So what happened is that Lesbos has always received refugees from Turkey. It's so close, right? And so since the 80s, when the UN started recording data, they've had a few people arrive every few months or whatever, and it's not a big deal. The Greeks would go down to the beach, they'd pull people out, and they'd send them on their way to mainland Europe. Not a problem. The people in Lesbos, 80% of them are descended from what they call the Asia catastrophe refugees, which is the Ottoman Empire persons exchange that happened between Turkey and Greece. You probably are more familiar with the Armenian genocide. There was a Greek version happening around the same time. And so many of the people from Lesbos are descendants of those refugees. They have a very strong compassion for people who are fleeing difficult circumstances. And so it was never a big deal to pull people out of the water. In 2015, that number went from 20 a month to 3,000 people a day. And they just didn't know how to cope with that. So they were doing everything they could. Keep in mind that Greece is under austerity measures from the EU, and so they're economically suffering themselves. Many of them are struggling to feed their own families right now. But they gave them everything they had. They washed their clothes, they gave them a warm place to stay, and then they just transported them from the part of the island where they were landing to the administrative capital to be processed. And then those refugees were being sent to mainland Greece and then out into Europe. So at that time, 3,000 refugees are arriving. You can see in this picture, the life jackets are actually made out of this weird foam. That's not actually, it's not a legitimate life jacket. And they didn't know what to do because 3,000 people a day are arriving, strip their life jackets off, slash the boats, and all of this garbage is piled up on their beaches. The beaches that give them sustenance. They're a tourism place, right? All of Europe vacations in Lesbos. And so they were really distraught, torn between this idea that they have this humanitarian obligation. I hope that's not my phone. Torn between they have the humanitarian obligation that they have and also between their livelihood that's already pretty precarious. And so what they did is they cleaned up all of these life jackets and stored them in the dump, what on Google Maps is called the life jacket graveyard. Eventually, the flows started to get so intense that the world finally noticed. It had been going on for a while before the UN arrived, before the charities that you're familiar with, Mercy Corps and the IRC, all of these charities started arriving, the big ones. And they said, okay, don't worry, we've got this under control, step back. And then the Greeks were like, okay, we're so happy you're here, thank you for helping us, what do you want us to do? And the charity said, well, get out. I mean, go about your lives, get out of here. And so the Greeks were really confused by this because they've been doing this for generations and they thought they were doing the right thing. They got nominated for Nobel Peace Prizes and the Nansen Refugee Award for their humanitarianism and the fishermen who were pulling people out of the water. And suddenly they were told, well, this isn't your problem anymore, go away, go about your business. There's no tourists who are going to show up on Lesbos when refugees are washing up on the shore. That's not how people want to spend their vacation. So what is this life that they think that they're going to go back to? What happened is there grew this intense animosity between locals and the aid agencies. Because the aid agencies basically cut them out. Now the locals start feeling like, well, there's so much money that we hear on the news that's coming to help refugees, but we don't see any of it, right? There's still people sleeping in our yards and in our streets, and they've cleaned it up quite a bit, but where's all this money going? So now there's a conspiracy that the aid agencies are just taking this money for their own, that they've completely cut them out, and they've never asked the locals what they want in order to help their society keep going. Like, what can you do to help the Greeks who are suffering too? No one's ever even talked about the fact that the Greeks have suffered a severe amount of trauma from hosting thousands of people who were literally sleeping in their front yards when there was nothing else they could do, right? The NGOs come in and they say, okay, but who cares? But that's actually a really big deal. It's a really big deal when the people who help in crisis, their needs aren't met as well. And Lesbos is a case study in this, because what started as the potential for so much humanitarianism has turned into a terrible xenophobic situation. Now, there are still Greeks who believe that they have a humanitarian duty to help the refugees who come. The problem is that there are many Greeks who believe that if you help a refugee, those refugees will call home and tell everyone how hospitable the Greeks are, and just more refugees will come. So if you help, you are part of the problem. And this has torn apart communities who have been together for generations, right? Kids whose kids play together at school aren't allowed to speak anymore because now they fall on two completely different sides of the spectrum. They have the people who are sympathetic to refugees and the people who think that it shouldn't be something that we're responsible for anymore. And one of the contributors to this is the EU-Turkey deal. So the EU signed a deal with Turkey to basically pay them to stop the flow of refugees. And it sounds like a great thing when you look at just the numbers. In just the numbers, the flow of refugees into Greece slowed from 3,000 people a day to a couple hundred people a month. That is amazing. That's a very considerable amount of pressure released. The problem is that with that deal, the part that we don't see is that those refugees were no longer allowed to just be moved onto mainland Greece and further into Europe. Now there's this whole sharing deal that goes on, right? So the deal is we pay the Turkish to both stop the flow and also take back anyone that we deem to be not a legitimate refugee. And in exchange, the EU is supposed to take people who have been screened in Turkey. Turkey is one of the largest hosts of refugees in the world. So some of those people who have been screened then can go into Europe as resettled refugees. That's how the exchange is supposed to work. The way that it happens right now, in order to make that work, is that all of these Greek islands have become detention centers. So Lesbos has a former military barracks that hadn't been in use for a long time. It was built to hold 2,500 people, and it holds an estimated 8,000 or more people at any given time. because it takes so much longer now to process people from the Greek islands to be legitimate refugees and then move on to mainland Greece. People froze to death the last 3 years in these camps because they just stopped moving. So where the Greeks before were just helping people along their way and letting people transit through, now they've become this holding center, and they know that there's a different kind of humanitarian crisis happening just outside their town, right? 8,000 people living in a 2,500 person barracks. The way the barracks were set up, it was for men, and all of the bathroom facilities are located within the single men barracks where they keep the single refugees. And so women and children who are there unaccompanied basically have to risk some kind of insecurity every time they go to the bathroom. And the Greeks know that this isn't right, but they don't know how to handle it, and they're not allowed to be part of the conversation. The NGOs all know, but this is controlled by the municipality and the EU. It's all out of their hands. So everything is happening in a way that doesn't involve the locals' voices, it doesn't involve the refugees' voices. And so a once awarded humanitarian community has now become this place of serious civil unrest. I always say bad news when I come to these things, but that's on the side. I took 2 students with me, one from the humanities program at ODU and one from the international studies program at ODU. Both of them are working on their thesis on Lesbos, one on how the media has influenced public perception of refugees in Greece, and the other on, she did interviews with locals about how their life has changed and their sentiment changed over time. So we volunteered for a week with different organizations that are operating inside the refugee camps. There are 2. There's the terrible, awful one, which is a detention center, no one is allowed in. And then there's the vulnerable populations camp, which is the ideal refugee situation. Right? They have freedom of mobility. They live in containers which have air conditioning and heat. An NGO delivers food to their door every day. And so this character of camp in Lesbos is actually, it sounds amazing. And from the work I did in Rwanda, the Congolese in the Rwandan camps would kill to have fresh vegetables delivered to their door even once a week, right? But, so part of me really struggles with the fact that the Europeans have all of these resources that they move into Greece, and they also have direct flights to Rwanda. They could easily take that, that same energy just once a month, once a year. It would make a world of difference. But the reason that they go to Greece is because Greece is a tourism destination for Europe, and people volunteerist their way. So you can spend a week helping refugees, feel really good about it, and then the next week you just go lay on a beach and enjoy yourself, right? It's a great setup to get like a conspiracy, right? And this just breeds xenophobia. And what happened is, at some point, this started spiraling out of control, and the local organizations that try to still work with refugees and keep the relationship between locals and refugees really good are caught in the middle, because the European NGOs that come in, these little ones, they hate the locals because they're like, the locals are so mean to us. And then the locals hate the NGOs because they're like, well, they're so rude and they're so mean to us. And this has spiraled out of control. There are rumors in the Greek community that all of these NGOs, not all of them, but some of the NGOs are actually staffed by European criminals who are serving out their public service time in Lesbos. Like, it's gotten out of control, right? If a refugee gets arrested, they'll never be held, but so the police are just letting them steal our things, right? The rumors are starting to circulate, and once that happens, it's very difficult to break that. I don't know that we can ever go back to that moment when the Greeks, with their full hearts, pull people out of the water, right? That has been completely disassembled by so many things, including large humanitarian aid structures, small humanitarian aid, all from goodwill, ultimately. People were trying to do the right thing. They just did it in such a really complicated way that what we have now, when we were there for 2 weeks in May, we witnessed 3 violent protests just in Lesbos. Lesbos is only 80,000 people, That's the size of Portsmouth, Virginia. If you can imagine Portsmouth having 3 violent protests in 1 week, it's unimaginable, right? That's not something that we can even think of. And they're not all anti-refugees, right? One of those protests was pro-refugees, and it was the weirdest thing I've ever seen, people in black masks and protesting for refugees' rights. Refugees themselves have protested in the square. That's the farthest right corner. A bunch of Afghan women in Moria camp, which is the one with 8,000 people. They just couldn't deal with the insecurity anymore, and making their children have to, use the bathroom in these really precarious situations. And so 12 of them and their children walked out of the camp and lived at the square, which caused all kinds of problems because there are people who are pro and supported them, and there are people who are anti who were trying to disassemble their tents. And all of these tensions are circulating in Lesbos, because what you see now is not the original wave, but sort of the aftermath as this thing drags on. What we thought was going to be temporary turns out to be a very long-term situation, and we're 5 years in, which takes me to Rwanda. So Rwanda, this camp is Kiziba refugee camp. It's one of several. There are over 70,000 Congolese refugees who live in all over Rwanda in camps. And what's important about them is, most of you are probably familiar with the 1994 genocide in Rwanda, but that genocide spilled over into the Congo and caused a conflict that still goes on today, mostly completely unrecognized by mainstream media. So the Congo actually has one of the largest numbers of internally displaced people. The top 3 countries for internal displacement, the Congo and Syria, and number 1 is Colombia, if you believe it. And so none of these crises really the Syrian one does right now, but none of these crises really make the news. You'll notice that this camp was established in 1996. There's a separate wave of people who came in 2006, but since then the camp is closed. That means that only people who are under the family reunification program under the UN can enter the camp. So if you have family who is there, then they'll take you. But for the most part, the population's been at about 16,000 for the last 20-something years. So think about that. What is 20 years? 20 years is the entire life of a 20-year-old. A 20-year-old can have children, right? That means it will be the entire life of their children. This is generations of people who are born into refugeehood. So think about that. Think about mobility and your passport and all of the privilege I was talking about earlier. This isn't just that. This means also the people who are born as Congolese in Rwanda know nothing about the Congo. Right? Congolese people tend to be, from where they came from, in the Kivu provinces, they tended to be people who did cattle. This was their thing. I mean, they had other occupations, obviously. They, were mechanics, they were teachers, they were lawyers, but many of them who did agriculture were predominantly cattle farmers. You come to Rwanda, which is the size of Maryland. It's a very, very dense population, and there's no room for refugees to have cattle. And you think, okay, that's not a big deal, but it's a big deal over 20 years, right? That means that the things you should have taught your children about livelihood in the Congo, you can't. You can say it all you want, but I mean, if somebody told me how to raise a cow, it doesn't help me raise a cow, though I would love a cow. It doesn't help you at all, right? There's no perspective. And so you end up with a whole generation of people who have lost the opportunity to learn skills that should have been handed down. And not only that, many of the kids who came to Kiziba camp as children, they don't even know where they're from in the Congo. They got separated from their family, or their family was killed. And so their biggest fear now as adults is, but if Rwanda told me tomorrow I had to go home, I don't know where that is, right? And they also, there's a whole long story about how their citizenship in the Congo is really precarious, and the Congolese don't see them as citizens, and the Rwandans don't see them as citizens. They're sort of by default stateless, so they're not considered officially stateless. But 20 years, more than 20 years in a refugee camp is so much lost potential. Now, Kiziba camp is really special in that it's actually a really well-run camp. It has a governance structure. The refugees are elected to certain positions, and they serve at the president level, and then it goes down to the neighborhood level. It's very well organized, it's very safe, very clean. They take a lot of pride in their community, and the teachers in the schools told me that their schools actually outperform the Rwandan schools in the Rwandan educational system in all of the surrounding communities, right? Because they believe so much in education and the potential of moving on one day to somewhere else. So whether that's to another country where they can get an education and get their lives started again, or whether that's going back home, they really believe in education. And for them, the biggest torture about this is this idea of protraction. So UNHCR, the UN Refugee Committee agency, I don't know if they call themselves, it's UNHCR, they define protraction as any population of 25,000 people or more who have been refugees for 5 or more years. 5 or more years, this is 20 on. And you don't think about protraction. I don't know the last time it made the news. It's not something that comes up very often. 80% of the world's refugees are in protracted situations. That means that when you become a refugee, you will probably be a refugee for about 5 years. But the average time spent as a refugee is over 20 years right now. Over 20 years, right? That doesn't mean that this is unique to this situation in Rwanda. It means that that number that doesn't seem that high and isn't really that much on the rise, those people have been refugees for generations. And this doesn't include the Palestinians. That's a whole separate number, right? So you can't say, oh, the Palestinians are driving the number up. They're considered different. 20 years for the vast majority of people. That means that when people flee, when we see them leaving Venezuela into Cucuta, when we see them leaving Turkey into Greece, this was always going to be a long-term thing. That's what history shows us, right? We treat refugee situations as if they're temporary, as if this is a thing that we could just deal with. And ultimately what we're not thinking about is long enough term. So this is Emmanuel, and he was really interesting. So in this picture, he's about 24 years old. He came to the camp when he was young. He was in the 2006 wave and finished all of the schooling that Kaziba offers, which was 10th grade. If you finish 10th grade, you have the opportunity to get a scholarship to go outside to finish high school, but only 2 kids every year get that scholarship, and it comes and goes with the economy. And so basically, if you get a B in school, what's the point, right? They'll still finish, but they know that their chance of that scholarship is over. And what that means is your life will be on pause from 16 until indefinitely. And he said this really interesting thing. He's very philosophical, but he said this thing about how refugees' minds are like lights, right? They go out. That everyone has this spark in them, but ultimately, if you're kept with nothing for so long, no possibility to try to do something with your life, eventually that goes out and people just really stop thinking and they just live day to day. The refugees in Kaziba eat corn, beans, salt and oil. That's their food delivery. They live on top of a hill and the market is very difficult to reach. And so that really is the vast majority of their diet every single day for the last 20-something years. It's its own form of torture. It causes all kinds of physical problems, right, that will haunt them even if they get the opportunity to resettle. Their bodies have been malnourished for a good portion of their life because that amount of food is what's calculated by some probably statistician and nutritionist in Geneva as the bare minimum to sustain adult human life for 1 month. And even then, their food rations only come every 4 to 6 weeks, very unpredictably, so they don't even know how to budget their food. And this is a picture. It just gets worse from here. If you're feeling sad, probably go grab a cookie. But this is a picture of some of the leadership. So I mentioned that they have a hierarchy of governance, and for my dissertation, I interviewed the leaders of different villages and neighborhoods at the structural level. And actually a year ago yesterday, 11 of them were killed, and 65 of them were arrested. And the reason is because, so December last year, the World Food Program cut their rations by 25%. And then in January, 10%. And they said, well, we can't live off of this. We already didn't get food rations when we need them. And so they walked out of the camp. 3,000 of them walked out of the camp. They walked 15 kilometers to the bottom of the mountain where they're kept. And what they did was they camped out in front of the UN office. I've seen videos that the refugees have sent me where they were like singing and protesting. There was nothing violent about their protest. But what they asked for was, please help us find some solution to this. We've been here waiting peacefully. They've done nothing wrong for 20-something years, which is pretty impressive, right? There's been no violent incidents. No one's ever tried to radicalize. No one's ever really committed any crimes outside of teenagers doing petty theft within the camp. It's been relatively mild, which I think is impressive for 20-something years. I mean, I can't even say that about my own city, my own neighborhood, right? And so what they asked for was, please find a way to resettle us somewhere else or let us go home, right? We would rather die in conflict, trying to live our lives, than waste away here as you starve us slowly to death. Because they don't have an opportunity to farm, they don't have an opportunity to leave and get jobs because they don't have work permits and they get exploited. And if you ask the Rwandan government, they'll say, well, they can get a work permit, but it's limited to a very, very, very tiny population, right? So that's not a way to subsist for most of them. If you think about what they're asking, they're saying, let us go home to die. I mean, you can't keep us here and starve us to death. We would rather have the opportunity to try. And this is what I mean when I say, like, everyone always has this desire to go home. There's always some connection to home, but also that people, our basic need is that we continue with the opportunity, right? We're not saying, the American dream really isn't about the white picket fence. It's not about the house or the boat, right? It's about the opportunity to try for it, right? To at least work some job that might lead to something, even if you don't make it. And that's all they're asking for. So they're not trying to come to the United States to take our dream. They're not trying to go into other countries in the area to take their dreams, right? They just want the opportunity to let go of the pause button and hit play, right? Let me hit play on my life and get started. And so it's a sad story. Most of them have been accused or convicted at this point of basically inciting political unrest in Rwanda, which the government is pretty firm about. They don't like any kind of commotion, really, which is, remnants of a genocide and post-genocide world. But Amnesty International and a lot of organizations like the UN are fighting that they had the right to peaceful protest. There's no indication that anyone in that group did anything violent. The Rwandan military fired tear gas into the crowd and then just started shooting people. And there were women and children, and no one was really trying to, their concern was never and is never with the Rwandan government. They've always been very thankful. Thank you, the Rwandan government, for hosting us here. Their claim is really that we should be allowed to move on. And so Zygmunt Bauman, if you know him, is a philosopher, and he talks about this idea of wasted lives. That even in the American prison system, there are lots of people, thousands and thousands and thousands of people who are packaged away in different places where we can't see them. And it's just as convenient for our society to go on without thinking about them. That refugees who live in camps, it's easier to send them aid and just keep them going instead of really sitting down and thinking about what it would take to resolve their situations. And I think Kiziba is one of those places. It's not alone. There are, like I said, 80% of refugee situations are protracted. Many of them live in urban areas and are not in pause in the same way, but still live precariously, not knowing whether or not they could be deported from the community, whether they're going to be paid for the job that they're working because they don't have legitimate papers. And this life on pause affects the next generation of people, right? So when you think about the biggest threats to our world and our safety, to me, it's not the migrants who are walking up to our border, the 3,000 people that we can easily assimilate, right? We take in millions of people every year on tourist visas and student visas and all kinds of things, right? Like, you probably don't even notice. maybe you don't even know that about 300 refugees are resettled into Hampton Roads every year, because you still may never have met one, right? That the amount of absorption that we can do for migrants is pretty vast. My biggest concern, I think, that we don't talk about is the generation of people who are left without a future, without mobility, without any kind of security to know that they could work for a future. Because what would you do? What would you do if you were a second generation refugee with no future, right? I mean, if you think about the people who are primed for radicalization, it's those who are never given the opportunity to have a chance to live a life, right? They don't need to live the perfect life, right? They just want some opportunity to be like anyone else. They're not even asking for citizenship. They're not asking to be permanent residents of your world, right? Many of them hope that the refugees I talked to in Gaziba, even the ones who had never been to the Congo before, felt some draw to the Congo because their parents talked about it when they were growing up, and they know that that's home. And so their dream was to go abroad, get a college degree that they can't get in Rwanda, and then eventually, when the Congo is ready, come home and help restore the Congo to what they believe is the greatness that it should be. And I think that that's something that we should all be able to support, right? I mean, that's the original immigrant dream that we had, right? Come here, make a better life for yourself. But they don't want to just make a better life for themselves. They want to make a better life for everyone, right? Restoring your country is probably one of the most noble things you could do. And so I think, I don't have like one message, which is, the qualities of good talk. But resettlement is just one tiny option. So when I talked about those numbers of people internally displaced, stateless, asylum seekers, refugees, and all of the vast numbers of 65 million people who are displaced right now in the world, resettlement is one option. The other options that the UN promotes are return to your home country when it's safe, and local integration wherever you are. And only of those three solutions total, less than 1% of displaced people every year gets any of those solution options: return, integration, or resettlement. So basically, when someone gets resettled to the United States, they have won the lottery, and they know that. So when refugees come to the US, they are put on 90 days of federal assistance. So there's an agency that helps them try to acclimate. But think about what that means, right? Like, you've lived in a refugee camp for 24 years, never paid a bill. You've never, had a formal address. You've never, had a job that has regular hours that you have to report to. You never pay taxes. And then you have 90 days to learn how to do that in the American system. I mean, I moved to Japan after college, and I think it took me a year to figure out what was what. The language, the way they pay their bills at the convenience store, which was so weird. All kinds of things, right? And a lot of refugees, some of the problems that the Refugee Resettlement Agency deals with is even just about hygiene and wearing underwear to school, right? There's so many basic things that you also have to teach that are culture related, but also, when we think hygiene, it's not because refugees are dirty, it's because they're often on water rations, right? They've lived their entire lives knowing that they have a liter of water per day for 5 people, and so it's not, this is about trying to help them fit in the United States, also administrative things, going to the doctor, and they're put on the US welfare system, and that's part of the benefit of being a refugee in the resettlement program. But that's a whole thing. I don't even know how to take the bus, which is a whole another mobility privilege, but they have to learn to do all of these things associated with social services. And the vast majority of resettled refugees in the United States are off of welfare in 5 years. Many of them have moved away from the crappy apartments that they were given when they came. And if you can believe it, the US government makes all resettled refugees pay back their airplane ticket. And so, in addition to all the things that they're learning, they also get put on a nice payment plan with the government so that they can pay off their ticket here. We don't even give them that, right? I guess we believe firmly in the bootstraps mentality. And so this is, when you think about the lottery though, that they won, and most of them still know that they won the lottery, even with all of that, it's still a very, very big deal. This is a graph of our resettlement ceiling and the number of people that we admitted. So every year the president sets a ceiling, the maximum number of resettled refugees that will allow into the country under the resettlement program. You've probably heard that the Obama administration was about 75,000, which is pretty consistent. It was a little higher, but pretty consistent. And the Trump administration has dramatically decreased that, which is the thing. But not only has he dramatically decreased it, we haven't even met the ceiling. So the ceiling last year was about 40,000, and we made it to about 20. So the lottery pool is shrinking dramatically. And when the U.S. shrinks its number of spots for refugees, so do the other countries. This is an issue of burden sharing, right? So when one country decides that this is the future, then others take suit. That means it gets even harder and harder and harder to find any long-term solution to refugees. So I'm running out of time. This is just a graph. It's not that important to the conversation, but this talks about the waves of locations from which refugees came over the years. And so you can see the Vietnam refugees coming, and then different waves of migration right now. Okay, so I ran over my time, I'm sorry.